is a price maker. It's setting prices. Its quantity doesn't depend on price alone. Its quantity depends on the marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost curve, and thus it also depends on the demand curve, because you can't get the marginal revenue curve without the demand curve, right? So, as a result, just looking at a monopolist's marginal cost curve is not going to be its supply function that indicates its responsiveness to changes in prices. So there is no supply curve as there was in the competitive framework for a monopoly. Now, when you look at this and you think about it for a moment, you say, gee, that's very straightforward, right? It's straightforward, correct? PhD students on their oral exams have failed this question. How do you explain that? You ask them, by the way, would you please explain to me how to generate a supply curve for a monopolist? And they sit there dwindling away on their papers, going to the blackboard, playing around, and they can't derive the supply curve. And the reason they can't is because it depends structurally on the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, and the firm's marginal cost curve. But all of you would answer that, right? Now that we've discussed it. Okay, let's look at a case study. And this is a wonderful case study that looks at the pharmaceutical industry here in the United States, and similar structures exist in other countries. Some not quite so dramatic as in this particular country. But it turns out that the governmental policy basically wants to create incentives for pharmaceutical companies to make major discoveries, to find new APIs, to find new therapies. Many companies are out there trying to find a therapy for cancer, and huge research and development dollars are being expended for that purpose. One of the incentives that the government offers, it says, gee whiz, if you make that discovery, and it's truly a unique discovery, that is to say, it is non-obvious, and there are all sorts of criteria to determine what's non-obvious, we, the government, will give you a 20-year property right to have a monopoly on the sale of that drug. As a result, there's no substitutes, right, if that's a unique therapy. And moreover, the government says you don't have to worry about entry of potential competitors. Right? But the downside of that policy, it's one of the principles, there's always trade-offs, right? Now, the downside of that policy is that the firm that makes that discovery, hypothetically, let's suppose there is a major discovery for therapies to cure cancer, that firm has 20 years in which it can set monopoly prices. And by the way, one obvious, ask yourself the demand curve for everyone that has cancer. How price sensitive is that demand curve? Not very price sensitive, right? In fact, you would expect it to be very, very inelastic, which means that the monopolist can really extract pretty much, if not totally, the willingness to pay on the part of patients who were in the prevalence population with regard to cancer. Okay. Adam, you got, don't put your hand over your mouth when you speak. Come on. Speak up. Well, the argument drawing the simple distinction between what's obvious, that means you didn't have to incur huge research and development costs. If it's obvious to everyone, it's part of the prior art. So as a result, you don't have to create incentives for people to develop and market that obvious product. So the patent law makes a distinction between discoveries that are obvious, namely, there's no real invention here because the existing knowledge or the existing prior art is already clear that you could have developed that product and offered it to the marketplace. So that's why they use the distinction between obvious and non-obvious. Does that make sense? Okay, somebody else help me here. You think that doesn't make sense? You're going to give somebody a 20-year monopoly for a product that's based on existing knowledge and is obvious? What, isn't that the implication? No, on the contrary. The implication is that it has to be non-obvious. Pardon? It has to be a major discovery. Now, the patent office does make mistakes. It makes mistakes, and it does an evaluation of the prior art, and it says, gee whiz, this is non-obvious, so I'm going to issue a patent, which is like a property right to a market. I'm going to issue that. Now, later, various potential competitors can come in and argue that the patent's invalid because many of the claims of the patent are, they would argue, obvious from the prior art. That happens. But what I don't follow is why you say that the government shouldn't be involved. If it wants to create incentives by giving a monopoly right, then it's going to do that if and only if the existing knowledge is expanded through some discovery. They don't want to give that right to somebody who's just simply duplicating what's already out there in the way of knowledge. Okay, that's what I said. By the way, help me. Didn't I say that before? Is that what I said? Okay, go ahead. Oh. All you asked was what? And the question was again? Obviousness. Obvious. Oh, sir. Oh, no. Okay. I appreciate your clarification. I'm putting myself in the position of the patent office with regard to issuing a patent that gives somebody a 20-year monopoly right. And that patent office charge is to give those patents only for major discoveries. And major discoveries are defined by that patent office as discoveries that expand the frontiers of knowledge and are non-obvious. Because if they were obvious and there was real willingness to pay in the marketplace, then it already should have been in the marketplace. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. Did you, Gabe? Okay. Fair enough. All right. So here's the example. A monopolist of a typical drug ends up setting marginal revenue equal to its marginal cost. And as a result, it generates monopoly profits. But somewhere along the line, when the patent expires, now there's a whole bunch of new entry, right? Because those profits are an incentive for entry to take place. And when entry takes place, it takes place in the form of generic drugs. And generic drugs, you're all too young to be on prescriptions, most of you, I hope. I know a fair amount about this, given my age, but nevertheless, it turns out that generics, once the patent expires, they come onto the marketplace and prices plummet. They literally plummet. And once again, there's a trade-off, right? And the trade-off is, as a government, I want to give incentives for major discoveries. So I'm going to give these rights. But do I really want to give it to them for a full 20 years? Do I have to give it to them for a full 20 years? Or will they still invest the research and development and the efforts required to make major discoveries with less than 20 years? So to facilitate the generic entry, and by the way, note here, what I have is for the period under which the patent exists, this is the quantity moving through the market, this is the pricing. Now generic entry comes in, and we move out to a competitive structure, namely price is equal to marginal cost. Okay? Now, because of this trade-off, namely, I want to offer some benefit to consumers, but I still want to create incentives for investment in research and development to expand knowledge and define new therapies and new cures that previously did not exist. And what the government has done is come along with a piece of legislation, which is called the Hatch-Waxman legislation. One congressman here from California and a congressman from Utah jointly designed this legislation, which set a whole bunch of rules of the game with regard to generic entry. And those rules of the game are a generic, by the way, the generic, to get the language right, a monopoly patent for a drug is called the incumbent drug. And the drug that comes along is a generic of that patented drug. And the generic is bioequivalent to the branded drug. So, aside from manufacturing dysfunctionalities, the two products are precisely the same. They're totally interchangeable. But the price on one is much less than the price on the other. And it turns out that the generic, once a generic manufacturer files with the FDA what's called an ANDA, which is nothing more than the mechanism of delivery and describes everything that the branded drug described when it got its patent, then they have to wait a period of 30 months before they enter the market, and the incumbent drug gets to bring a legal action against them during that 30 months, arguing that they're infringing their patent. And what does a generic manufacturer do under these rules? It brings a set of claims that the branded drug its patent is invalid. Why? Because prior art was already out there, and it's not really a valid patent. So they go through a process of sorting out this dispute before the generic enters. But then, once that generic enters, then 6 months later, a second generic can enter, a third generic, fourth generic, etc. But there's a real incentive for the generic to get its application before FDA first. Why? Because it gets a 6-month right with only 2 firms competing in the marketplace, having to wait for another 6 months before additional firms enter the market. And when the additional firms enter the market, prices for many branded drugs, this is not true in all cases, but prices can fall as much as 80% in short order, in a couple of months. Okay, that's competition. And it also shows you that the monopolist who has the patent is actually setting prices very high. Okay, let's turn to welfare cost. In the monopoly, we know the equilibrium is one in which price is greater than marginal revenue. And moreover, there must be some gains from trade that aren't being captured. And this comes back to my opening comment in today's lecture. Namely, because the willingness to pay is above the marginal cost, there is some transactions that should take place to maximize efficiency that are not happening. Okay, let's look at this. The monopoly output turns out to be too low. You could increase the total surplus with a larger quantity. Let's look at this graphically. And as a result, there's a dead weight loss. Okay, let's come back to the demand curve, the marginal cost curve, and ask ourselves the question, what is the welfare cost or welfare loss of monopoly? And we're going to introduce here the notion of dead weight losses. Okay? All right. So this is the competitive quantity that should be moving through the market. However, and that's the point at which price is equal to marginal cost. And at that point, all the quantity that's moving through the market is moved through the market where the willingness to pay is at least equal to the incremental cost of providing that quantity. All right? Okay. Now, we also have shown previously at that price equal to marginal cost, total surplus is maximized. Okay, now let's look at the monopoly equilibrium. Now we have to introduce the marginal revenue curve because the monopolist's optimal profit decision is going to be where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's going to be the quantity QM. Okay, now look at the willingness to pay from QM out to QC. This is the willingness to pay. If we look at the marginal cost from QM out to QC, there's an opportunity for mutual gain from trade, right? And that opportunity is lost. The monopolist forces that loss by setting the monopoly output at QM and a much higher price than the market equilibrium price that would emerge from a competitive structure, right? And moreover, that little triangle there is the dead weight loss. And the simplest way to think about it is, gee whiz, there is some buyers out in the marketplace that are willing to pay more than the incremental cost for additional quantity, but the additional quantity is not available. Okay? So that is a measure of the dead weight loss, and that is the welfare cost. Now, price discrimination. Price discrimination, there are different types of price discrimination, but generally speaking, it is a situation where a seller in the market has power and is able to distinguish people based on their willingness to pay or some other attribute that tells us about the willingness to pay. Right? Okay. You sell different amounts of goods at different prices to different buyers. And the critical characteristic with regard to price discrimination will turn on the variability with regard to the willingness to pay on the part of consumers, purchasers, or buyers. Now, if the firm could charge a higher price for buyers with a higher willingness to pay, and the firm is a profit maximizer, you should expect the firm to do just that, right? Pursuing its own self-interest. All right. Pardon? I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. I'll go back anytime you ask me as long as you get to class on time. Is that a fair deal? That's a benefit of our bargain going forward? Okay, fair enough. All right. Okay, price discrimination versus a single price monopoly. Okay. Here, in everything that we've looked at up till now, the monopolist charges the same price for all the buyers of the quantity that the monopolist is prepared to offer to the market. Okay? And coming back to our notion of surplus, if that is the price, if the price charged is a monopoly price PM, then the consumer surplus is this rectangle, right? Everything below the demand curve, above the price. Right? The monopoly profit is here represented by the rectangle, and Also, the deadweight loss is here as well, represented by the triangle as we saw in the prior graph. So now we look at this and say, gee whiz, what we have is a transfer of surplus from the buy side of the market, the consumer side of the market, to the sell side of the market. Because in a competitive marketplace, price would be down here at marginal cost, right? And if the supply or the marginal cost is perfectly elastic, then all of the surplus in this market would go to consumers, right? But now what the monopolist has been able to do is extract consumer surplus from the buy side of the market. Yeah? And in doing so has created a deadweight loss because once again, for this quantity above QM moving through the market, there is a positive gap between the willingness to pay and the incremental cost that is not being captured and is lost in the way of welfare. Okay? Now, suppose that, hypothetically, I understand, hypothetically, suppose that the monopolist could charge a different price for each consumer or buyer's willingness to pay. Right? Now, here is the counterintuitive result. Under those circumstances, you would maximize total surplus. But you're not going to like the equity outcome or the distributional outcome because all that surplus will be captured by the monopolist. Every last drop. Okay? Let's look at this. This is perfect price discrimination. And the monopolist, as I indicated, captures all of the consumer surplus as their profits. There is no consumer surplus that's left. Why? Because the willingness to pay, the monopolist is setting the price for that consumer at their willingness to pay. Hence, there is no surplus for each and every consumer that lies along this demand curve. Now, obviously, that's not practical, right, Adam? You brought up the question about, I don't see how you measure this willingness to pay. And that is a serious concern, and monopolists don't know everybody's willingness to pay. But they do know what attributes influence people's willingness to pay, and they take advantage of that with regard to price discrimination. Let's look at a couple examples. And by the way, the other key point here is when there's perfect price discrimination, you maximize total surplus, there can be no deadweight losses under those circumstances, right? You only get deadweight losses if there's some gap between the willingness to pay and the incremental cost of providing that good. Okay. Now, in the real world, perfect price discrimination is not possible. No firm knows every buyer's willingness to pay. Buyers don't walk around on their forehead and walk into a store and say, my willingness to pay for this particular product is much higher than what it is, right? That would not be in their best interest to reveal that information. So what companies do is that they divide customers or consumers or buyers into groups based on some observable trait. For example, the age. Right? Let's look at a concrete example. Movie tickets. All of you are too young to know this. But if you're a senior, guess what price you pay at the movie box, at the movie theater? A price that's dramatically different than what the announced price is and what others who are not seniors have to pay. Moreover, if you go to an afternoon movie, it turns out you're going to pay a different price than someone goes on Friday or Saturday evening. And that is a perfect example of movie proprietors taking advantage of the willingness to pay and the difference in the willingness to pay among their clientele. Airline prices. If you fly to New York and stay over Saturday night, your airfare will be dramatically different than if you fly home on Friday. Why? Yes? Precisely. And those people have a willingness to pay which is much below people who are flying for business purposes. Because one of the reasons that their willingness to pay is higher is because somebody else is picking up their fare, right? Which will leave that out of this particular example. But nevertheless, it turns out there's an instance where the airlines are obviously making a distinction, recognizing the price sensitivity of different types of travelers. Moreover, if we fly overseas, there's a first class, a business class, and an economy class. There's different pricing for each of them. Clearly, they've already set up their planes to take into account what the difference in the willingness to pay is. Okay. Other examples. Discount coupons. Not only do various retailers use discount coupons as a way of trying to create loyalty, as airlines do with regard to their Mileage Plus, right? If you walk into CVS and you purchase something, they print out your ticket on the purchase, and maybe there will be some discount with regard to buying some other good, right? They're trying to get you to come back in the store, but they're also trying to get information about the difference in the willingness to pay. If people save all their coupons and store them up, have you ever been in a queue in CVS where there's 7 or 8 people and each of them have coupons and they're rolling out the coupons and it takes a long time to complete the transaction? Well, those people generally have a lower willingness to pay. And the people who, like myself, who have a false perception about the opportunity cost of their time, I will leave those queues. Because I won't wait, because first of all, I haven't saved up all the coupons to take advantage of the discounts. But more importantly, I think my time is so valuable, I'm not going to wait for 15 minutes for all of those people to complete their transactions. Having said all that, the retail stores, still attempt to discriminate by recognizing that keeping and maintaining those coupons generally happens for people that have a lower willingness to pay. So if you want to increase the quantity that you're moving and take some advantage of their relative willingness to pay and exercise some discriminatory market power, you will use them for just that purpose. Okay. Now, this may bother some of you because certainly all universities throughout the country represent that they're doing this for the societal well-being by